Let's talk about some cards. In my free time, as one does, I like to peruse the community around the Cyberpunk TCG. This includes the Discord and Reddit, but I also dabble in reading the comments on Kickstarter as well as other people's YouTube videos. I've seen my fair amount of discourse surrounding the game, but there are a couple conversations that have piqued my interest in ways that others simply haven't. Reboot Optics is a card that gives a friendly unit +4 power, at the catch that it'll die at the end of your turn. I say your turn because you're only allowed to play this card on your own turn. This card reminds me a lot of an old Hearthstone card, Overwhelming Power. Why does that last part matter? It's simple, it doesn't. Astute fans of the game might recognize that the card I just described does not match up with the way that Reboot Optics works in the context of 2077. Reboot Optics is a quick hack that affects an enemy, causing their eyesight to reset. It allows you to sneak past someone undetected, or sneak up to them and kill them. It's a very covert and sly ability, in stark contrast to the very aggressive and large style of gameplay that the TCG card facilitates. This, of course, has sparked a handful of discussions across multiple platforms. People are asking the exact question I pose to you all right now. Why does this card work the way it does? It's a fair question, and one I hope to tackle over the course of this video. People have asked this in their Discord, and in fairness, they have responded to this question over there. In one thread I saw, Kawa responded saying the card was essentially a test card, it was simply a prototype. The implication I got was that either the card was being reworked, or that it only worked that way in the starter kit to fill a niche. This wasn't the only discussion of its kind. The other discussion I see a fair amount of is whether or not the gigs are flavorful, and why they work the way they do. The game is largely viewed as a competition between mercs as to who can end up controlling more gigs. You add a new one each turn to the pool of them by rolling it from your fixer area. You and your opponent then take turns attacking one another to steal them from your rival, winning the game when you control 6 gigs at the start of your turn. You can also win by controlling a majority of the dice during overtime. These aren't new discussions to the community either. Hell, my screenshots of the specific incidents I wanted to talk about are weeks old at this point. I wanted to make sure I grabbed them before Reddit's algorithm just absolutely buried them, thus preventing me from finding them to talk about later. I don't want to blow this out of proportion either, this is not rampant discourse. People have posed the question and there has been a fair amount of discussion on the topics, but it probably still makes up less than 1% of all the discussion I've seen. Nevertheless, it drew my attention as someone who likes to analyze these kinds of questions. So I asked myself, does Cyberpunk have a flavor problem? I'm sorry to anyone who wanted some kind of long build-up before I came to a conclusion, but that's not really the way I want to talk about this. For the sake of making sure as many people hear this as I can, I'll just answer the question right now for you. No, I don't think the game has a flavor issue. I obviously still want to talk about why I think that, so let's just work backwards from there and see where we end up. Let's go back to talking about Reboot Optics again. We already talked about the fact that this card affects your own cards and not your opponent's. The way the ability works in the game is resetting an enemy, so we could conceive of something like that as applying a debuff to an enemy unit, like giving it a -4 for the turn. This would track from a flavor perspective because units are weaker when they can't see. It's also a quick hack in the game, but that mechanic is also absent from the card. I'm not arguing this card is a flavorful interpretation of Reboot Optics. I agree that it's not. The reasons I've listed are all valid reasons to think the card doesn't really represent its name. But I'm also going to argue that it doesn't really matter either. Let's suppose for a second that we just stick a little negative symbol on the front of the card, so instead of being a +4, now it's a -4. Also, let's allow it to target an enemy unit. Let's remove the destruction clause while we're at it, because otherwise this card is a jacked removal spell, if a delayed one. I would argue this version of the card is actually quite bad, like worse than the baseline version of Reboot Optics. I don't think it's a mystery that I'm not a huge fan of Optics. I think the card has a couple of niche applications right now, mainly with exactly Caliber, but outside of that I only ever play it because sometimes decks just have to. The version of this card that I've described has even fewer use cases outside of just being sold than the original one does. At least with the original you could theoretically steal 2 gigs. You can't stop your opponent from stealing a gig or 2 because the card isn't a quick hack. It can help you kill tapped guys, but that feels so much worse because that's functionally the card's only purpose. So let's make it a quick hack then. This undoubtedly makes the card better by becoming a quick hack, but we run into a new problem that has less to do with the card and more to do with the way the alpha kits work. The alpha kits have a clear lack of things to do on your opponent's turn. Really the only thing you can do is call a legend when you're attacked. It's the only way to flip 2 of them in a turn cycle. I don't mean this as a criticism either. I largely assume this is by design. I've talked about it before, but it bears repeating here that these kits are designed to onboard players who have minimal TCG experience by not inundating them with complex interactions. Cards that work on your opponent's turn get very intricate very quickly. We know the game will feature a back and forth on opponents' turns. We already have it to a degree on cards like River Ward and Goro Takamura, not the one from the Alpha Kit. But even above that, we know what a quick hack does because they already showed us one. We know that the card type exists and has a mode where you can play it on your opponent's turn. I sincerely doubt that they didn't consider making Reboot Optics a quick hack because we've seen a quick hack already. This circles back to the response we got from Kawa. This is an alpha card. I want to talk a little about the idea of flavor versus function. I know that the two aren't mutually exclusive, but this battle can still be a tightrope walk, so I'll call it more of a balancing act than a competition. Flavor is important for card games. It's important that cards feel like they represent whatever is supposed to be depicted on them. This is an ongoing battle not just for Cyberpunk, but all card games. However, with a game rooted in an existing IP like this, it's exceptionally important. You have characters and settings and concepts that already have a concrete identity, and you want to make sure that you adapt them in a way that's satisfying to players. If they don't make sense within the context of a card game, then players won't be interested in playing them. They'll feel a disconnect between the cards and the character. I think the game actually does this pretty well. I think my favorite example of a card I really like flavor-wise is Cyberpsychosis. This card works on several levels. It only affects units that actually have gear attached to them. You can't go Cyber Psycho without cybernetics. Then it makes them stronger, but will ultimately kill them at the end of the turn. I also really like Uridine. I think that his role as a rocker boy recontextualizes the term gig on the card to instead refer to a performance. If the venue is maxed out, then Carry will perform. The reward for which is that you get to draw 2 cards. The way that River's form of vigilantism is reflected in the way that he helps other units gear up, notably being able to give someone else a pistol. The way Alt Cunningham is banished in exchange for running a powerful program to you, or how Jackie's ambition is reflected in him getting stronger and weaker depending on the amount of gigs you have. I would consider all of these cards to be top-down design. That is to say, cards whose framework is built to fit a specific mold. All of this is in service of the idea that the game has a lot of flavor going for it. However, going back to my original form versus function discussion, every card can't be a flavor win. Or rather, you can try and make that possible, but more often than not, it just isn't feasible. At a certain point, you recognize that cards need to do things. Sometimes you need to be able to fill certain gaps in your set design, regardless of whether or not they feel thematically appropriate. Top-down design is important, but you can't build every card this way. Otherwise, you run into the risk of having a bunch of cards that feel thematic, but don't play very well together. Form is an important aspect in my opinion, but it shouldn't take precedence over the functionality of the game. I would much rather they build a balanced card game than make every card feel like it's a perfect one-to-one replica of its video game or TV show counterpart. True kill effects are rare in Cyberpunk, aside from system reset and suicide, and they're expensive as hell in the game, but you need cheaper removal than that. We've already seen why this is important off the back of cards that get absolutely huge like Jackie Wells. Most every program we see and use in 2077 is a quick hack, but you can't make every single program function at all times. It would make for a very constrictive design space if you had to factor that in. This may result in some quick hacks not being labeled as such, but I think the game will be better for it overall. If Reboot Optics was a symptom of a greater problem, I would have more of an issue with it. If the cards felt nothing like the game they were based on, then there would be little incentive to have it even be 2077 themed in the first place. Setting your game in an existing IP is great for recognition. You don't have to try and sell people on all new characters, a setting, or terminology. Most people will come in with at least some understanding of what to expect, even if they have no knowledge of TCGs. But this sword cuts both ways. People have certain expectations, and you do have to meet them. Additionally, because the first set features multiple instances of a character, Weirdco is in a semi-unique position where they can have one version of a legend heavily rooted in top-down design, and one version that leans more on functionality, effectively letting you have it both ways. We haven't seen all the cards yet, but we have a decent enough sample size to instill the confidence in me that the set will continue to strike this balance in a way that will hopefully satisfy most people. The other major discussion I've seen comes in the form of gigs. For the uninitiated, the core gameplay centers around the set of RPG dice that each player takes turns rolling. They start in your fixer area, and once you roll them, they become the basis for your score, also referred to as your gigs. The total number on all the dice you control is referred to as your street cred, which some cards will refer to. I think that far and away the biggest complaint I've seen about the game has centered around this mechanic, both in terms of flavor and in terms of function. The purpose of this video is much more focused on the former, but I feel as though it should at least cover both topics in this video. I like this mechanic function-wise. There's enough diversity in the way that dice are used that rolling low is not inherently a net negative. There are multiple ways to wield the random results of the dice, and there are multiple ways to manipulate them if you need to. Notably, the result on the dice does not correlate with your score in the game. If your d12 rolls a 3, that may not be the result you wanted, but it still counts as one gig all the same. Our understanding of gigs is admittedly a little different than the way they're presented in the game. Gigs are obviously missions that you complete. In exchange, you receive eddies for completing them and your street cred raises, which gives you access to better missions and cars. Most of this fits pretty well. Low-stakes gigs have less variety in their outcomes, but stand to yield less street cred. A d4 can obviously only roll so high. The amount of street cred you can obtain from a gig is random, but I would attribute that to how well you perform at the job within the context of the game. It's easier to do better at lower stakes gigs and harder at high ones. WeirdCo has also talked about how this mechanic does not draw its inspiration purely from the video game, which is where I think some people might be getting hung up. The TCG does use the characters from 2077 predominantly. The first set has a heavy focus on the main characters in Act 1. The legends that helm the starter decks are almost all present in what is arguably the most climactic scene near the middle of the act. We've seen a couple of the classic TTRPG characters, but I mean that's cheating. They're all the people who appear in 2077 at one point or another, and they all use the designs based on their appearances in the video game as a result. Because of this, the dice mechanics are really the only true TTRPG representation the game has. Which is fine. I know that we're starting with the most recognizable characters from CDPR Cyberpunk first. They are partnered with them to create this game after all. I also get why fans might see this as something of a disconnect, even if I don't view it that way. Now, where I actually can understand the confusion is the fact that your game revolves all around stealing gigs from your opponents. You accomplish this by attacking with a unit that goes unblocked. Units at 10 power or more steal 2 gigs instead of 1. One way of looking at it could be that characters are competing to steal the influence of completed gigs, attempting to take credit for them, thereby obtaining the street cred for a completed gig. This kind of makes sense, but I think it runs up against the method of acquisition. This, to me, implies that attacks are more about averting the influence of your opponents as opposed to physical violence. Fights are, instead, a battle of words, not just raw strength. And I don't think this tracks nearly as well. You can't tell me that someone like Placide is a very influential individual. Maman Brigitte basically tells us as much. There are parts of it that I think make sense. The idea at its base is solid, but I think it runs up against how combat works in this game. This whole conversation goes back to the idea of form versus function. The two are not mutually exclusive, but there will be scenarios in which you have to choose between one or the other. Do I think there's zero flavor in the way the gig system works? Absolutely not. I talked about the fact that rolling a dice to me is like completing a gig for a fixer, and our performance in each one varies by the stakes, aka the size. In that regard, we are essentially fighting for control over Night City, and our band of cohorts is helmed by 3 legends. The other factions, Arasaka, Militech, what have you, still have to perform missions to keep their slice of Night City under control. They may not be gigs in the traditional sense, but they're gigs in everything but name. The flavor is present in enough of it that I'm willing to be more lenient in the places where I think it's weaker. Every card game runs up against this issue. The cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Have little to do with the source material outside of being the game the characters play. They're functionally 2 different things, the game and the show. There's no flavor in any of the mechanics in that regard. Pokemon gets close with the prize card victory method, but they too run up against the constraints of being a competitive card game. Energy as a method of attack is pure fabrication for the TCG. A very limited number of attacks actually require any kind of charging up, and that things like evolution don't work anything like they do in the game. You ultimately can't create a one-to-one adaptation of a video game in a TCG. There are constraints to the genre and medium that these things exist in, and even if you could, the resulting product would likely be a balancing mess. Something like 2077 is not designed to have you compete against another player. As a result, balancing abilities to be fair simply doesn't matter. I think the game has a strong understanding of the world it's trying to adapt, and it's present in the core gameplay loop of gigs and street cred. Many of the cards have clear parallels to their game characters or elements that they draw their names from. But even still, you can't expect that of every single card in a game. Pokemon's N has fuck all to do with the amount of Pokemon you have left in your team. His goal is to liberate Pokemon from people in the first game, so he would likely punish you for having more Pokemon on your team, not rewarding you for it. It's ultimately a difficult web to navigate, but I think the game has done well with the tools that it has. I am curious though to see what everybody else's thoughts on the flavor of the game are, so if you have any thoughts or opinions, leave them down in the comments and I'll be happy to discuss them with you down there as well. I'm looking to limit myself to about one video a week while we sort of wait for new stuff to come about, so until then I hope to see you all playing the game whenever it comes out. I don't fucking know.